How many times have you had trouble with your neighbors? When your dog barks loudly, they call 911. When your front lawn is not trimmed, they also call 911. But this time is completely different. When the man changed the Wi-Fi password, it made the neighbor woman angry and called 911. Let's see what happened next. That shook the whole neighborhood. DeMarcus Williams had always been tech-savvy. As a freelance graphic designer, he relied heavily on his home internet connection. So when his Wi-Fi started lagging inexplicably one evening, he knew something was off. Videos buffered endlessly, downloads crawled at a snail's pace, and even his smart home devices struggled to stay connected. Frustrated, he opened his router's admin panel to check the connected devices. That's when he noticed something strange. Several unknown devices were leeching off his network. He frowned, scrolling through the list. Someone had been freeloading on his Wi-Fi, and judging by the number of devices, it wasn't just a one-time thing. Shaking his head, DeMarcus decided enough was enough. He quickly changed his Wi-Fi password and set up a stronger security protocol. A satisfied smile crossed his face as he watched the list of unauthorized devices vanish from his network. That should teach whoever it is, he muttered to himself before shutting his laptop. Little did he know, this small action would trigger an outrageous chain of events, leading to unexpected police visits and a tangled web of trouble he never saw coming. The next morning, as DeMarcus sipped his coffee and reviewed emails, a loud, aggressive knock rattled his front door. He wasn't expecting anyone, so he cautiously approached and peered through the peephole. His stomach sank. It was Karen Mendoza, his next-door neighbor, a 50-year-old white woman with shoulder-length blonde hair, meticulously styled to frame her sharp features. He and Karen had never been close, but he was well aware of her reputation. She was notorious for being nosy, entitled, and quick to call authorities over the smallest inconveniences. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked the door and cracked it open. Before he could greet her, Karen stormed in, her face red with fury. "How dare you?" she snapped, jabbing a manicured finger at his chest. DeMarcus stepped back, startled. "Excuse me? You changed the Wi-Fi password," she shrieked. His eyebrows shot up. "Wait, what?" Karen crossed her arms and glared at him, as if he had committed an unforgivable crime. "I've been using that Wi-Fi for months. And now, suddenly, I can't connect. What do you think you're doing?" DeMarcus was at a loss for words. "You were stealing my Wi-Fi?" Karen scoffed. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. The internet is a public utility, and I have the right to access it. I have important things to do online. Do you have any idea how disruptive this is?" DeMarcus blinked. "Karen, it's my internet. I pay for it. You never even asked me." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on. You weren't using all of it. I figured you wouldn't mind." DeMarcus let out a dry laugh. "Well, I do mind. And I'm not giving you the new password. If you really want it, you'll have to take it up with God." Karen's face twisted in disbelief. "You're seriously going to be that selfish?" DeMarcus crossed his arms. "It's not selfish to secure my own internet. This isn't just about bandwidth. It's about protecting personal and professional data. If someone gains unauthorized access, they could steal sensitive information or even compromise my work." Her expression darkened, like the sky before a storm. "You'll regret this." She didn't give him a chance to react. Nodding sharply, she turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. DeMarcus sighed and shook his head. He had dealt with entitled people before, but this was a new level of audacity. He had no idea what Karen planned to do next, until he heard the wail of approaching sirens. The police car slowed down and stopped in front of DeMarcus's house. The black officer in the passenger seat pressed the doorbell repeatedly, the sharp chimes echoing through the house. Inside, DeMarcus, focused on his work, had to pause mid-task. Curious and slightly uneasy, he bent down to peek through the door's peephole. His breath hitched at the sight of two uniformed officers standing at his doorstep. A wave of anxiety washed over him, but he steadied himself, inhaling deeply before reaching for the doorknob. The door creaked open, and a young black officer, no older than 25, stepped out from the passenger seat. His movements were deliberate, adjusting his belt as he scanned the house with sharp eyes. Officer Omari walked with steady confidence, his posture upright but non-threatening. Behind him, the driver's door opened, and Officer Jackson, a white man with a skeptical expression, emerged more slowly, taking his time to survey the surroundings before following his partner to the door. "Sir," Omari began, "we need to ask you a few questions." DeMarcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain composed. "Of course. But first, can you tell me exactly what I'm being accused of?" Jackson glanced at his notepad. "Your neighbor, Ms. Mendoza, claims you hacked into her devices and made threats against her." DeMarcus let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's ridiculous. I changed my own Wi-Fi password to keep unauthorized users out. That's it." "Since when is that a crime, officer?" Omari nodded. "So you're saying you didn't access her devices in any way?" DeMarcus didn't need even half a second to think. "Not at all," he affirmed. "If anything, she was the one using my internet without permission." Jackson glanced at his partner before shifting his gaze back to DeMarcus. He raised an eyebrow and asked, "Do you have any proof that she was on your network?" DeMarcus hesitated. He could show them the router logs, but he wasn't interested in escalating things further. Instead, he simply replied, "I know what I saw. But I'm not here to press charges. I just want to be left alone. I'm very busy with work. Would you officers like to come inside and check for yourselves?" Omari turned to Jackson and exchanged a quick glance, before subtly signaling an okay with his fingers. He then turned back to DeMarcus. "We don't see any evidence of a crime here. However, if Ms. Mendoza decides to file another report, we may have to return." DeMarcus exhaled slowly. "Understood. I'm always ready to cooperate." Karen, standing outside, scowled as the officers turned back toward their vehicle. Frustrated, she kicked the fence, her face contorted in anger. DeMarcus noticed her clenched fists and furrowed brows. She was seething. Looking at her expression, DeMarcus realized that up until now, he had always tried to avoid trouble with neighbors. But after today, he knew he wouldn't be able to live comfortably anymore. The police could show up at his door at any moment. DeMarcus went back to his unfinished work, but he couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to his conversation with Karen. He couldn't understand how someone could be so irrational and entitled. Curious about Karen's desperation, DeMarcus decided to check his router's connection history. As he scrolled through the logs, his eyes widened. Karen had not only used his Wi-Fi for shopping and YouTube, but she had also been active in racist forums and groups. As he scrolled, his eyes stopped on a forum post titled, "That Black Neighbor is a Freak." His blood boiled. Since moving into this house, he had never even spoken to most of his neighbors. Why would she call him a freak? The deeper he looked, the more disturbing it became. Among the sites visited, there was evidence of an anonymous account accessing illegal web pages related to buying and selling social media accounts, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. DeMarcus wasn't certain if the account belonged to Karen, but the possibility was chilling. He realized this was bigger than a petty neighborhood dispute. This was a serious crime. Knowing he needed to protect himself, DeMarcus copied all the logs and connection data onto a USB drive. He sat back, gripping the small device tightly. Karen was hiding something serious. In DeMarcus's mind, Questions swirled. Were those illegal activities really hers, or was someone else using her connection? Should he report this to the police right away? He wrestled with the thought, knowing that one call could escalate the situation even further. Karen was still fuming. Days had passed since her last confrontation with DeMarcus, and she was enraged that the police hadn't intimidated him into giving in. Her lips curled into a sneer as she dialed 911. This time, she would make sure the police saw DeMarcus as the menace she wanted him to be. 911. What's your emergency? The operator asked, her voice calm and professional, yet carrying an undertone of urgency, as if prepared for the worst. Karen's voice quivered with fake distress. My neighbor, DeMarcus Williams. He's brutally beating his dog. I can hear the poor thing screaming. He's using a leather strap. Please, send someone now. Minutes later, the familiar sight of flashing red and blue lights appeared in front of DeMarcus's home. The same two officers, Omari and Jackson, stepped out, their expressions unreadable. They approached the door, and Omari rang the bell firmly. DeMarcus, startled by the sudden interruption, jerked his head up from his desk. His heart pounded as he took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease creeping into his mind. He ran a hand over his face before pushing himself up and walking to the door. With a sigh, he opened it, only to see the officers standing there once again. Omari straightened his posture, his broad shoulders squared, and his face unreadable. His deep voice carried a measured firmness as he locked eyes with DeMarcus. Mr. Williams, Omari started, his tone even but authoritative. We received a report of animal abuse taking place here. DeMarcus's brows furrowed as he raised his hands slightly, his expression shifting from confusion to controlled frustration. His voice, though quiet, carried an unmistakable certainty. I'm sorry, did I hear that correctly? Animal abuse? That's insane. My dog has been at the vet for over a week. He's sick. Not letting DeMarcus finish his sentence, Jackson immediately interjected. But Karen says she heard you beating him. He crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing slightly, as he studied DeMarcus's reaction. DeMarcus placed both hands on his head, his face contorted with anger. This is unbelievable. This is a complete fabrication, he exclaimed. I am an animal lover, and... He scoffed. That's impossible. Call the vet. They'll confirm my dog hasn't been here. Omari exchanged a glance with Jackson before nodding. A quick call to the veterinary clinic confirmed DeMarcus's story. His dog had indeed been under medical care for the past week. Jackson let out an irritated sigh, while Karen, standing behind them, stiffened. So her report was false, Omari said, turning toward Karen. Karen's face twisted into a look of desperation. Wait, he's been threatening me, she blurted out. I fear for my safety. DeMarcus shook his head, exhaling deeply. He had tried to stay silent, but this was too much. That's enough, he said, his voice calm but firm. Karen has been stealing my Wi-Fi for months. When I cut her off, she threatened to call the police if I didn't give her the new password. And now, here we are. Both officers turned to Karen, their expressions hardening. Her mouth opened, then shut, her facade cracking. Jackson sighed. Ms. Mendoza, do you understand that filing false police reports is a crime? Karen stammered, but no words came out. DeMarcus crossed his arms. I've let her lies slide before, but not anymore. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a USB drive, handing it to Officer Jackson. You need to see what's on this, he said firmly. Jackson took the drive and immediately walked to the patrol car, plugging it into his laptop. His face tensed as he scrolled through the files. The evidence was overwhelming. Logs of Karen's online activities, interactions with racist forums, and even indications of fraud. Jackson exhaled sharply and turned to Omari. This isn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. We need to take her in for further questioning. Omari nodded. We'll be filing a report on this, Mr. Williams. We also need you to stand as a witness in this case. Your cooperation would be greatly appreciated. Before heading back to their car, Officer Jackson turned to Karen with a cold stare. We'll be seeking an arrest warrant and will return to your home soon. Karen's face drained of color, her confidence crumbling. For the first time, she realized her games had consequences. Meanwhile, the officers began to doubt her credibility further when DeMarcus presented undeniable evidence of Karen's criminal activities. Meanwhile, DeMarcus watched her in silence, knowing that her reign of petty terror was nearing its end. The following morning, DeMarcus was sipping his coffee when another knock came at his door. This time, the officers weren't here for him. Officer Omari and Officer Jackson stood with a search warrant in hand, one meant for Karen's house. Mr. Williams, we'd like you to come with us as a witness, Jackson said. DeMarcus nodded and followed them next door. Karen opened the door, still in her robe, her eyes widening in shock as she saw the document in Omari's hand. What is this? She snapped. A warrant to search your home, Jackson said plainly. As the officers searched, Karen's panic grew. When confronted with undeniable evidence of her online activities, she tried to twist the narrative. I only posted in a few groups. They were just jokes. I had nothing to do with any illegal hacking or selling accounts, she insisted, her face turning red. Then, with a venomous glare, she pointed at DeMarcus. He's the hacker. He set me up. DeMarcus sighed. Seriously? I truly regret ever being your neighbor. Karen suddenly lunged at him in a blind fury, her nails aiming for his face. Before she could reach him, Omari intercepted her, swiftly pinning her arms behind her back. Calm down, Ms. Mendoza, he said firmly. But Karen wasn't finished. She jerked against Omari's grip and yelled, "Get your hands off me. I don't want to deal with a black cop." Then, in a final act of desperation, she spit in Omari's face. Silence fell over the room. DeMarcus stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The sudden escalation of events left him momentarily speechless, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He had expected Karen to argue, maybe even resist, but this level of aggression was beyond anything he had anticipated. Jackson's jaw tightened. That's it. You're under arrest for assaulting an officer. Omari wiped his face, keeping his composure as he cuffed her. Karen Mendoza, you are under arrest for assault, filing false police reports, and theft of services. Karen screamed as they led her outside, her neighbors peering out their windows in curiosity. During questioning at the station, Karen finally admitted that her nephew, Brandon, had given her DeMarcus's Wi-Fi password. When confronted, Brandon initially denied any involvement. But under pressure, he broke down, confessing that he had been hacking into multiple neighbors' Wi-Fi networks and selling stolen social media accounts. As for DeMarcus, he finally felt relief. His life could go back to normal. As he stood outside watching the police drive away with Karen in the back seat, he shook his head. All this, he muttered, over a Wi-Fi password. News of Karen's arrest spread like wildfire. Within hours, local news stations and social media platforms picked up the story, turning her into a public spectacle. Her face was plastered across headlines, and neighbors whispered about her disgrace. The community, once indifferent to her entitled behavior, now saw her for what she truly was, a criminal and a fraud. Karen's legal troubles deepened as more of her online activities came to light. She was charged with multiple offenses, including theft of services, assaulting a police officer, and spreading hate speech in online forums. Meanwhile, her nephew Brandon, faced even graver consequences. His confession led to a large-scale investigation into the billion-dollar cyber fraud network he was a part of. Authorities arrested several members of the ring, effectively dismantling a massive social media hacking operation. With Karen and Brandon out of the picture, the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. Karen's house was seized as part of her legal proceedings, and she was officially banned from returning to the community. The once imposing figure who terrorized her neighbors was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. For the first time in months, DeMarcus felt at peace. He no longer had to deal with Karen's harassment or worry about his Wi-Fi being stolen. He could finally focus on his work without unnecessary disruptions. One evening, as he strolled through the neighborhood with his dog, he couldn't help but reflect on how one small action, changing his Wi-Fi password, had unraveled an entire criminal operation. It was a sobering reminder of how the smallest decisions could have the biggest consequences. As he scrolled through his phone, he saw his story trending online. People from all over were sharing their own experiences with toxic neighbors, and some even thanked him for exposing Karen and Brandon's crimes. With a smirk, DeMarcus tapped the share button and posted a message. A simple Wi-Fi password change led to all this. Be careful who you let into your network, both online and in real life. And if you like similar stories, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next exciting story that may not be about DeMarcus, but about someone else.